My previous video on this channel was about my top 5 favorite American rock bands. It was a response to Professor Skye's video of the same subject, and he followed up his video with a top 7 English rock bands. And I went, well, I guess I have to do a sequel myself once again. Professor Skye actually saw my previous video, so shout out for the comment. He said we might be in some kind of beef now. I truly hope not. I might have gone a little bit too far with the ageist jokes in my last video. Was not my intention to offend at all. I need to emphasize, I watch Professor Skye like literally every day. I watch all of his videos, so I am by all means a fan. Do not mean to be insulting at all. And I do recommend his videos as precursors to these ones. I am not trying to present an alternative. I am trying to present an addendum, because it just so happens that Professor Skye listens to a lot of classic rock. Like, a lot of the bands that he's suggesting are older bands that are mostly before my time, and while they may have been contemporary to my parents' time, my parents did not listen to a lot of old music when I was growing up. So it tends to be that I only really know stuff that came out since I was born in 1991, although that will be less true on today's list. And there's going to be a lot different about how I'm handling this one compared to the last one, because last time Skye's criteria were his personal enjoyment of the band, how influential they were, and how American they were. And I kind of followed in the footsteps of that to give my own version of that, but more so selectively talking about 90s and onwards alternative rock bands and nu metal bands and stuff like that. Just basically filling in what I thought were blind spots on his list of more modern stuff that he didn't take into account. When it comes to English bands, though, not only do I not know as many recent bands, I know shockingly few English bands. And as a matter of fact, whereas Professor Skye, even though he went out of his way to just use the words English and British interchangeably in the video, and he explained why, he only actually talked about bands from England specifically, no Scottish bands. I'm not going to be able to get away with that. To even reach 5 bands that I really like, I have to include some Scottish bands. So I'm going to do mine as my top 5 UK bands. I'm not doing 7, although I will bring up some honorable mentions. And some of the stuff on my list was mentioned in Skye's video. We will definitely be sharing one band between our lists at a very high up position. And there is also a few that he mentioned as honorable mentions that I will either also mention as honorable mentions or end up putting on my list. I'm not sure yet. I'm deciding the list right now as I stare at the 9 bands that I actually wrote down. And I'm sure I'm going to realize a bunch more. Like last time, I picked 5 that I thought were solid picks for me to talk about and to kind of justify why they were on my list. And then I wrote out a paragraph worth of honorable mentions in the description of the last video. And as people left comments, I kept remembering more bands that I had to add into the honorable mentions. So I ended up with this massive number of honorable mentions. I don't know if I'm going to get there with this one because, again, I just don't know that many UK bands. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if it's just that UK rock wasn't as popular since the 90s. I know that the UK had a massive electronic movement, so maybe this would be different if I was more of an electronic listener and doing that list. There'd be a lot of more modern bands, but I just don't know a ton of English rock bands, so I'm going to give you what I've got. Honestly, the only reason I even feel that I should make this video is that my number 1 was not mentioned in Professor Skye's video at all, and it was mentioned a lot in the comments of Professor Skye's video. So I'm going to talk about that one band in particular more than anything else. Alright, I'm going to start by talking a band that Professor Skye mentioned as an honorable mention, which is Black Sabbath. It is pretty much impossible to tell the story of heavy metal music without Black Sabbath, and being that I am a metalhead since I was a kid, they're very important, Now, granted, I did not actually listen to Black Sabbath until I was at least in my late teens. I was familiar with Ozzy Osbourne. I'm sure I knew a couple of Sabbath songs, but I remember not even really liking them them as a kid. And then I think around the time probably of the Iron Man movie coming out, I became more curious about the album with Iron Man on it. It was also in Guitar Hero, of course. So at some point I started listening to Paranoid, and Paranoid is just an amazing album. Like, pound for pound, one of the easiest things from its time period to still throw on, and it still feels weirdly like ahead of its time, particularly in the fact that so many bands that copied Black Sabbath just aren't as good, which is, like, I guess maybe it's normal that the copycats wouldn't be able to surpass the original, but there's been like 50 years of bands like directly copying Black Sabbath, to the extent that what is referred to now as like the stoner rock or stoner metal genres are basically just bands that sound like Black Sabbath. And not a lot of them are even close to being as good. You know, I had a period in high school, late high school, where even though I wasn't a stoner, I was listening to a lot of stoner rock. Ironically, a lot of that music I don't think actually sounds that good when you're high. But, you know, I was listening to a ton of like Electric Wizard and Witchcraft, which is a Swedish band, and like just all this stuff that, like, once I started hearing Black Sabbath, was like, oh, this is all just Sabbath riffs, you know? And I haven't even really gotten that into the Sabbath discography. They have a lot of albums that I've never heard. I know there are people who really appreciate different eras of the band. I've even seen videos defending, you know, the singer who was neither Dio nor Ozzy Osbourne and the albums that they made in that period. So, you know, the Sabbath catalog runs really deep. The different members of the band also have done like split off stuff and all kinds of stuff that's influential and important. So yeah, it's again, it's hard to go wrong with putting Black Sabbath on a list like this. Professor Skye even kind of indicated like, yeah, if he just was a bigger fan of them himself, he probably would have put them on his list because they obviously belong there. But I like them enough to slot them in at number 5, even in spite of the fact that you know, I've got so few actual bands from the UK I'm going to talk about. My number 4, another band that Professor Skye mentioned, but as one that he's not personally that big into, would be Pink Floyd. And Pink Floyd, for me, is a band that I grew up with, not in the sense of like listening to their music a whole lot, but my mom was always really big into The Wall. Like, she thought The Wall was one of the coolest movies. She'd seen it a whole bunch of times around when it came out. And so, you know, I watched it as a teen, and it had a very profound effect on my thinking. I want to say it was the first thing I ever saw that really presented like the full psychological profile of a character, and it really helped me to appreciate like how much you are defined by your experiences and what you've been through. You know, it is kind of an intro to psychology movie, and in particular showing, you know, the psychology of somebody who grows up during this very specific time and place. And while I did not grow up in that time and place, I could still connect to what the movie is saying about, you know, how you are affected by your experiences. And so even if that character isn't that similar to me, I still got a lot out of, you know, learning and understanding, and the music in the movie is really good. You know, the Wall soundtrack has some absolutely phenomenal tracks. Comfortably Numb, Hey You, you know, these are songs that as a teen I was listening to pretty relentlessly, especially in my more despondent years of life. You know, I caught on to Dark Side a little later. We've actually talked about that in a full podcast I did with my brother and my husband. And you know, I listened to Animals a whole lot because my cousin had it on a burned CD that I put on my computer in my late teens. So those albums I'm very deeply familiar with. I am not nearly as familiar with the rest of the Floyd discography, and this is another case where I feel like it's kind of a blind spot. Like, I should know a lot more Floyd than I do. I have friends who are deep into the Floyd discography. You know, I've never loved Wish You Were Here as much as other people do. I do think that title track is really good, but it took me a long time to warm up to it, and even then, you know, I've never gotten super into that album or their other albums, but there is enough great Pink Floyd. And also, like, in terms of influence, I mean, they were the first, like, really major experimental rock band. The fact that Dark Side of the Moon is as, like, unhinged as it is and is as popular as it is, it's one of the top 5 best-selling albums of all time. Like, this album is why people know about experimental music. It's why so many bands have taken risks throughout their careers, and in my previous video I talked about like the Mars Volta and At the Drive-In as my favorite American bands and my favorite band of all time, the Mars Volta. Pink Floyd is obviously an influence on them to the extent that At the Drive-In covered a song from the first Pink Floyd album. I don't know when they did that actually, but it's in their compilation album that they put out after they were done. So yeah, Pink Floyd, also their influence looms massively over Coheed and Cambria, which I didn't talk about in the American bands video just because they're not very influential and it would have been like a very personal choice. But Coheed and Cambria is like an obsession of mine, like a band I listen to pretty relentlessly even today. So when you listen to their fourth album in particular, the Pink Floyd influence is heavy, very heavy. So yeah, could not have a lot of my favorite music without Pink Floyd existing first, so I have to give them props. Getting into the number 3 spot, this is where I have to insert my favorite Scottish band, because I like some of these Scottish bands more than a lot of the English bands that I know. Glasgow has turned out some really incredible bands, and I'm not talking about Franz Ferdinand, even though I really like them. Their first album I listened to a whole hell of a lot of times, and they have some great singles after that. Their music has been used in anime in some pretty fun ways, so love Franz Ferdinand. Also love We Were Promised Jetpacks' first album. If We Were Promised Jetpacks had more than one truly great album, maybe they would be the band I was talking about. But that first album is unbelievably good. One of the more underrated albums of the 2000s for sure. But the most underrated band of the 2000s, the most underappreciated, beautiful band that I love is the Delgados. The Delgados, who are probably best known for the fact that a couple of their songs got used in a relatively obscure anime from the early 2000s called Gunslinger Girl. They did the opening theme, The Light Before We Land, from their album Hate. And Hate is one of my favorite albums. You could say this is maybe closer to a pop album than a rock album. I could understand that. I think they're as much a rock band as like the Beatles are, or a lot of the dreamier kind of more psychedelic stuff that people talk about. I've seen them described as symphonic pop or power pop and stuff. They have plenty of guitar driven songs, maybe not as forwardly technical on the guitar side as some other stuff, but to me they're very similar to the Beatles in terms of category. In fact, one of the songs on Hate is All You Need Is Hate, as opposed to All You Need Is Love. So they are in many ways like a dark, sarcastic twist on a Beatles-type band. And they had several really great albums towards the end of their career, particularly their last two, Hate and Universal Audio, are favorites of mine. And they have two singers, a man and a woman singer, who would alternate sort of doing all the vocals for a song back and forth. So usually they're not singing at the same time. They're kind of just trading singing responsibility song for song. And it creates this really interesting nature to their albums where you feel like you get a lot of variety. Like every song feels very different from the previous one because it's got a whole different singer on it. And usually they're structured differently. There's like very powerful ideas and imagery in the lyrics. And as somebody who is big into lyrics, this will apply even more into the next band that I'm going to talk about. But as a big-time lyrics person, the Delgados has some very striking ones, including some that I've borrowed in my own music. People are always quoting back to me a lyric that I stole from the Delgados. Every single person who has told you that you couldn't lives in fear that you'll achieve the things in life they think you shouldn't, which is from a Delgado song, Get Action. I also have a song called Get Action. I quoted that lyric in a different song called Freak Power. But yeah, the Delgados, special place in my heart, great band, may or may not be really truly a rock band, but I would be remiss not to mention them, and I'll take any excuse I can get to talk about the Delgados. They ended basically because they were making really good music that nobody was listening to, and they just didn't want to keep doing that. But in my opinion, the most underrated band of the 2000s. Now, for my number 2 spot is where I am sharing one with Professor Skye, because Professor Skye loves the Smiths, and he cannot help himself but to not apologize for, but at the very least defend the quality of the music of the Smiths in spite of Morrissey being a big asshole. And I'm right there with him. Morrissey is one of the greatest lyricists of all time. The Smiths is really fun. So in the last video, I talked a lot about Jane's Addiction and Nine Inch Nails, and I kind of buried in there, I didn't really talk about the fact that those were my mom's 2 favorite bands when my parents got together. Like the end of the 80s, start of the 90s, my mom was an obsessive Jane's Addiction and Nine Inch Nails fan. And right before she was a big fan of those 2 bands, she was a huge fan of the Smiths. So all 3 of those are bands that when I was growing up, I was afraid of. Like, I would hear them, well, not so much the Smiths. I think my mom just didn't, like, basically she had lost all of her vinyl at some point in a fire, and so a lot of the older records that she had, she did not have when I was growing up, and it took a long time for her to collect some of that stuff on CD. I was afraid of Jane's Addiction and Nine Inch Nails. The Smiths I just kind of didn't know about until one day she picked up, like a like a best of collection or whatever, and I started listening to it, and I'm like, this is fucking great, that I downloaded the discography, and I would just kind of listen to it on shuffle and just listen to all their songs randomly. And there's so many good ones. There's so many, like, perpetually stuck in my head, just classic lyrics, classic structures for songs. At first I was more into like the sillier, more on the surface funny stuff, like Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others or Girlfriend in a Coma, and then you start working into the really memorable sad stuff. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, there not enough words can be said about the Smiths discography. Like, every song could be analyzed and broken down. Paint a Vulgar Picture is like the best, like, treatise on how the industry treats artists and how fans treat artists, and in like this very dark, sarcastic lens. They are kind of like the English Steely Dan in a way, where like all their lyrics are very vivid portrayals of dark kind of ironic scenarios and characters. But Morrissey kind of tends to more embody the characters that he talks about in a way that Steely Dan sometimes does. Sometimes they're a little bit more standoffish. And obviously, musically, they're very different bands. But they both excel in completely different ways. But nonetheless, yeah, my mom was huge into the Smiths. She was also huge into, I'm going to give an honorable mention shout out to Bauhaus here, because they're also really fun. I don't think they have nearly as consistent a discography as the Smiths, but if you just listen to their like Peel Session or BBC Sessions album, it's a great collection of songs. They influenced a lot of good stuff that was going to come later, like Nine Inch Nails. And also got to shout out The Cure. Even though I don't even think my mom was the biggest The Cure fan, she another band where she picked up the compilation of like singles, and there was a few that really stuck with me. I think Disintegration is a masterpiece album. There's not another Cure album I've heard that I really loved all the way through, but I also haven't deep dove them that seriously. But I really do like Disintegration a whole lot. So yeah, I'm just putting The Cure and Bauhaus as honorable mentions in with the Smiths, because in my mind they're all kind of categorically in the same emotional space, even if Bauhaus is maybe a little darker and more like goth. But I think all of that created the kind of culture that was going to lead into the 90s alternative stuff from America that I was talking about before. In fact, even the Smiths were a band that blew up in America before England, as I understand it. Like, their first big single being big in the US was what made them a popular band. But that's the only place where me and Skye's lists cross paths, and I know a lot of you will be like, how can you possibly not be into Led Zeppelin or the Beatles or, any of the other bands he mentioned? And I just never got that into them, Like, I like the Beatles. I like some of their songs. I would probably put them in honorable mentions, Abbey Road's a great album. Just has never hit with me in that very serious way. Whereas the English band that I have by far the deepest connection with is King Crimson. King Crimson, the absolute godfathers of prog rock, the most freakish, outlandish band, besides the Mars Volta, who I put as my number one of American bands. And I wasn't as into King Crimson when I first got into them as I became later. But like my road into King Crimson was like when I would go read Wikipedia articles of bands I'm a fan of, King Crimson's always cited as an influence. They're an influence on Tool, they're an influence on the Mars Volta, they're an influence on Shiner, who I mentioned as in the honorable mentions before, which is a band I only caught on to a few years ago, but like the fact that I could tell they're King Crimson influenced helped to get me into them. King Crimson has the most like bizarre approach to riffs, the most bizarre approach to song constructions, and these very deep, emotive, specific songs that none of them sound like anything else. Like no specific King Crimson song sounds like any other King Crimson song or any other song ever. They're all very particular creations. And so I think inevitably everybody will have different favorites, different favorite albums, different favorite songs from those albums. Their debut album is the one that I think the most people consider like an abject classic because it's got 21st Century Schizoid Man on it, which is an absolute barn burner fucking song. And their next few albums after the first one are not nearly as good as the first one. But my favorite King Crimson era is the 80s era, when they got an American Singer and when they did Beat and Discipline. In particular, those two albums are like just absolutely brilliant. And Beat was the first one I really listened to like a lot of. It's like their take on new wave, but with like such a angular, progressive flair to it. Like it kind of could be compared to Talking Heads, but to me, it just has more going on. It's like a little bit more dense and a little bit more musically involved than the Talking Heads. Like I love that album. I love Discipline to death. I love Red. I love Starless, and a lot of these are songs and albums where like I've gotten more into them over time, because when I was younger, some of like the long dissociative passages would kind of turn me off, or some shit just got too fucking weird for me. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little bit more patient, and the fact that I can't get this anywhere else. Like again, there's not another band that really sounds like King Crimson. Even the bands that take direct influence from them, they're not capable to imitate exactly what they sound like. Similar to what I said for the Mars Volta. It's like you can copy the ethos of this band and maybe some of how the guitar sounds, or maybe how the vocals are presented, but you cannot copy exactly what they did because the songs are just so goddamn unique, that like how could you possibly imitate it without just covering it? And, they're a big influence on bands like Primus, who would influence a lot of stuff that I like. I forgot to put Primus on the other list. That should be in the honorable mentions as well. They're just, like, incalculably influential on the music that I like, while also being one of my favorite bands. Like, not just a band that I think, oh, wow, they created so much I love. Like, yes, I enjoy. I'll probably put them as an honorable mention too, because they also influence a lot of my favorite prog bands. There are some Yes songs I really, really love. Never gotten that into Yes. They're to me like a pretty good band that influenced a lot of really great bands that I really love. But King Crimson is the one where like no matter what, I can always go back to this and I'm still going to enjoy it even after hearing so much other stuff that's like it. And that's not always true for prog bands, so those are my top 5 UK rock bands. And as I was putting this list together, it occurred to me that I could probably do a bunch of other countries more easily or with more results. Like, limiting myself to 5 on the American band scale was maybe a little bit of a mistake, because I think I could have gone for 10 or 15 or 20 without much issue, but I was trying to copy what Skye was doing. Skye went for 7 on the English bands list, and I was like, I can't get to 7. I could do some honorable mentions, but I'm not going to make it to 7 bands. But if I were to cover Japanese rock bands, I think I'd have an easy time getting to 5 or 10. I could probably hit 5 Canadian rock bands, could probably hit 5 Australian rock bands, 5, Swedish rock bands probably. So I might do that. Depends on how much demand there is. But this has been my top 5 UK rock bands. Hopefully this does not offend you. If somebody was really upset that Skye and I both didn't put REM in our list last time. If you really think that something else needs representation, make your own video. This is not your video. You are allowed to make your own. Your opinions are not invalidated by me having mine or Skye having his. If you feel like I can't trust your taste in music, if you don't like this band I like, all I can say is I feel the same way about your taste in music. I don't like the same bands you like. That's what makes life interesting, is we all have different tastes. So, if you're upset that something you like hasn't been mentioned by me or Skye, please make your own video. Sell us on it. Make us interested. Make us care. That guy complaining about REM did not convince me to go listen to REM, because it made me think, wow, their fans are fucking douchebags. Whereas a friend of mine telling me you got to listen to more Talking Heads made me go, okay, I will go check out some Talking Heads, So anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks again for watching. Shout out Professor Skye. No beef intended. And I'll see you in the next one.